Welcome to the 2-minute warning interview series, where we take an insightful, if rapid, dive into the energy transition and what it means for the Middle East and beyond. Many thanks to Samantha Gross, who is a fellow and director of energy security and the climate initiative at the Brookings Institute, for joining us today. Hi, Samantha.
How are you?
Very well, thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure.
Just want to start with some broad strokes about the cost of the energy transition and what could be deemed a healthy energy transition. With up to $0.1 trillion invested in new power capacity over the next 30 years in order to achieve that healthy transition, with another $14 trillion in the grid up to 2050, according to Bloomberg New Energy Finance, bringing us to a total of $30 trillion, which is obviously a rather hefty number, but it is spread out over 3 decades. But that is just the power sector. And of course, we have a multifaceted energy basket in the world, and increasingly so in the Middle East. So against that backdrop, how do we sustain the level of climate finance that's required with the need to have economic recovery from what is currently a pandemic triggered recession, but of course there'll be many other triggers for recessions up to 2050. So what lessons can we learn now to ensure that that climate finance stays on track? Because as we all know, there really isn't time to keep going around in circles and trying to figure it out. Time is of the essence. What would you suggest?
My thoughts on that are twofold. One of them is that we tend to focus on the costs because they're those who are more immediate and frankly easier to calculate. But we also have to think about the benefits or the avoided costs that are happening because we're making these investments. We can't just focus on the cost side. We have to remember the costs of climate change itself and of the things that we're trying to prevent. And that suddenly makes those investments look like very good investments compared to the actual costs of climate change. The other thing to think about is that spending on the energy system can be stimulative. Right now, we need to create jobs. We need to put money into the economy. And reforming and greening the energy system is a great way to do that. It's a good way to move our energy systems forward, to create good paying jobs, and to move us towards the energy system that we need in the future. Right now is a good time for governments to be spending money and for private industry to invest. And so the phrase "to never waste a good crisis" gets overused, I think, but this is one of those times when we need to make investments anyway. So let's make them into these green investments that we truly need.
Do you think that positive message is getting through? Obviously, we've seen a big rise in ESG investments this year, and the green bond market is growing significantly as well at the moment, and Middle East is one of the areas that's beginning to slowly pick up as well. So do you think that message is getting through as strongly as it needs to in order for things to stay on track in 2021 and sustain that positive momentum that we've seen this year?
You know, it's mixed. In some places in the world, you're absolutely seeing the focus on a green stimulus. Europe is a terrific example with the European Green Deal and how much they're focusing on investing that money in green ways. And you're seeing that a bit less in the United States up to today, but with the change in the US administration, I think we'll see a change in emphasis there. And so there are 2 very large economic groups that are doing this. I think it varies around the world, but I think in all places it's a good idea. And in all places, you're also seeing greater political pressure. Certainly in the United States, where I live, there was a real change in this year's presidential election from the past on how much people were pushing for climate action. And so I think the combination of those 2, the need for economic stimulus and the push from populations, will really help keep that momentum going.
How quickly do you think we'll see change on the climate agenda for the US from the Biden administration from the 20th of January next year when he walks into the Oval Office? How quickly do you think we'll start seeing newspaper headlines saying the US has committed to a net zero target?
You know, it's a great question. I think things that President Biden can do himself, he will do very quickly. I think you'll see him say that he wants to move towards a net zero economy very quickly. He promised that during the campaign. You'll see him rejoin the Paris Agreement right away. Harder things to do will be policy changes. Those take time, and some sorts of policy changes require Congress. And so part of it depends on how the last congressional elections shake out. But things that he can do himself, he will do very quickly. And he will also push for Congress to take action as well.
Something that's been bubbling up in the Middle East quite a bit recently, even very much in the last 6 months, has been this idea of a circular carbon economy, which of course is not a new idea by any means, but it's being formalized and structured in a new way in the Middle East, with Saudi Arabia very much spearheading the change, and a move that's gotten support from the G20 as well. Just talking about, of course, the US's future and how it's going to be shaping more of a new climate narrative from January onwards. Do you think the circular carbon economy is something that might feature in the country's future for the US?
I would like to see us move in that direction, just because the framework of the circular carbon economy really pushes on an all-of-the-above solution. The reduce, reuse, recycle, and remove really covers all the bases, and we need that. There are certain interest groups who want to see us continue to produce a lot of fossil fuels, others that want to see the United States out of the fossil fuel business. Whereas that framework, I think, really understands that we need all of those solutions. In some areas, fossil fuels are much easier to replace, the power sector, for instance. Whereas some of the areas where I've been doing some work are much more difficult to decarbonize. Areas where you need the attributes that fossil fuels bring, energy density, easy to move around. Sometimes you need heat from combustion. And so those are areas where fossil fuels may stick around. And I like the fact that that framework acknowledges that you need all of these things. So I think it's a good framework, and I'd like to see us adopt it because it really does push an all-of-the-above solution.
If we have the world's biggest oil exporter and also OPEC linchpin, and of course fossil fuels are very much at the heart of the identity of the Saudi economy and culture, if we have that sort of progress from a country that's so embedded in that, perhaps it will be a very good knock-on effect and a very good example for other countries. From your position over in the US and looking in, how viable do you think it is that a lot of progress will be made in Saudi Arabia on the circular carbon economy in 2021? Do you think that this momentum that's picked up and support from the G20, as I mentioned, do you think that's going to translate into real progress next year?
Well, what I see right now is a really good framework and a lot of good thought going behind this. But what we've not really seen yet is a lot of implementation and policy. And that doesn't surprise me. This is a very difficult multi-decadal change that this framework is describing. And so I hope that we see progress in this direction. I hope we see the Saudi economy thinking about how to use less oil and gas in its own economy, how to move towards renewables. But it's going to be a long transition for the Saudi economy, especially since you think of how reliant it is, not just on its oil exports, but in its own economy. You think of, say, water production, for instance, that right now they're essentially making water from oil by desalinating seawater. And there's a lot of processes there that need a lot of reform. But it's encouraging to see them take this step to do this depth of thinking on this process. And it's a step in the right direction.
I think the water scarcity situation that is rapidly gaining prominence in the Arab region for the rest of this century, and the concerns that it's one of the areas most at risk, as flagged by the World Bank and the World Economic Forum, is really beginning to make some of the regional countries sit up and go, oh, this isn't just about fossil fuels, this isn't just about being green, this is about having water, and you can't desalinate the volume that you'll need for the region's growing population. Some countries now have huge volumes of desalination, such as Qatar. I believe it's over 90% for their municipal needs is desalinated water. But as the population grows, because of course the region is home to one of the world's fastest growing populations as well, there just certainly won't be that volume necessarily to keep it going. So perhaps that's a major trigger, which leads on to my next question that I wanted to explore with you about. Do you think the Middle East is going to be under more pressure, or Middle Eastern nations are going to be under more pressure to start committing to net zero targets now that some of the world's biggest economies, including potentially the US, from January, definitely China, Japan, and so on, have committed to net zero by 2050/2060. What sort of pressure do you see that putting the Middle East under as they push for this greener future, especially as part of their national visions are to be knowledge-based economies, are to be green hubs of innovation and pioneering projects and technologies? How do you think this will factor in for them?
I definitely see that pressure going. In just the past year and even the past few months, we've seen this real increase of net zero by mid-century, 2050 or 2060, really become the standard that countries are pushing towards. We're moving away from thinking so much about just 2 degrees to this net zero paradigm. And so I think there will be increasing international pressure, particularly as the US rejoins the game and the US pushes towards this. I think there's an understanding that the Gulf economies do face particular challenges. They're likely to be in the petroleum business for a while, if nothing else, because they have among the world's cheapest reserves to produce. You sometimes hear the old adage in the industry that the last barrel of oil produced in the world will be produced in Saudi Arabia, and I don't doubt that. But on the other hand, this push towards net zero is really where the world is going. And I think particularly because many of those economies are oil dependent, but quite wealthy, you'll want to see there'll be a real push for them to go towards that goal.
And are you confident that enough has been done worldwide, if we're zooming out from beyond the Middle East? Are you confident that enough has been done this year worldwide to build a foundation for a net zero future by mid-century? Obviously, we've had these big announcements coming out. There's been a shift, a major shift in public opinion as well. Do you think that it's been enough of a crossroads to get us to where we need to be?
It's a difficult question. I'm really happy to see the ambition, but what I'm looking for is how that ambition gets turned into action. What policies there are that get behind this. Something I often talk about in my work is sort of the simple equation for decarbonization is electrify everything you can and decarbonize the electricity sector. And that's great as far as it goes. And I think countries are really pushing towards that. But something I don't see enough policy or push towards is decarbonizing those more difficult sectors, which is something we'll need to do to achieve net zero. Things like heavy transportation, aviation, certain industries, petchem, steel, cement. We have a really long way to go to decarbonize those kinds of things, which is what we'll need to do to reach a mid-century goal. So I think we have a ways to go to turning that from a goal into policy. So I'm happy to see the push, but I don't see the supporting policies yet.
How do you think that those can start to be achieved in 2021? Of course, not fully achieved for those industries you just mentioned, but what's needed to incentivize them? Because we already have the public pressure, we already have a lot of governmental push towards a greener future as well, and a lot of private sectors turning their heads. What else is needed to help those industries rather than make them villains, but to help them on this journey as part of their transition?
I think part of what we need is a recognition that renewables don't do everything, that renewables can't do everything. Renewables are fantastic, and the fact that they've come down so much in price has really been helpful in the level of decarbonization that we've seen thus far. But I think we need to recognize that an all of the above approach is needed, that we may continue to burn fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage or reuse in some industries where we just need their attributes. And so understanding that some sectors are difficult and understanding that we need research and development, and there are places where we may need carbon capture, storage, and reuse. I think understanding that is a step in the right direction, and putting policies in place to encourage research and development and to encourage carbon capture and reuse.
That loops us back to the value of a circular carbon economy in that holistic viewpoint.
It does, exactly. I think this holistic viewpoint and a recognition that the energy system is huge and complex and at the center of our economy and our modern life, starting at that point and going from there is really important.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Samantha, for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.